The blind bobcat was about to be euthanized, but my rescue cat did the unthinkable. The winter wind carved through the ashwood forest with a sound like distant voices, and Caleb Montgomery sat in his wooden cabin, watching steam rise from his teacup in spirals that reminded him of ghosts. At 73, he had grown intimate with silence, the kind that settled into a house after someone you loved was gone. Lillian had been dead for 2 years now, and the cabin felt larger somehow, as if grief had stretched the walls and made the spaces between furniture into vast, uncrossable distances. Maisie, his one-eyed cat, wound herself around his ankles, purring with that particular insistence that meant she wanted something. He reached down to scratch behind her ears, feeling the scarred tissue where her left eye had once been. She had come to him 7 years ago, abandoned in a cardboard box outside his small animal rescue station, and he had saved her life then. Now, he sometimes wondered if she had actually saved his. The letter sat on the kitchen table, already stamped and addressed. It was a formal request to the county to dissolve the rescue station, to close down the small operation he had run for nearly 2 decades. The words had been difficult to write, each sentence an admission of defeat. Due to advanced age and inability to continue operations, he had written, the phrase feeling like a stone in his mouth. He was tired, his joints ached in the cold, his hearing had been failing for months, and now he was dealing with an ear infection that made everything sound muffled, as if he were underwater. Most days, he felt like he was drowning anyway. Outside, snow began to fall in earnest, thick flakes that caught the light from his window and transformed the darkness into something almost beautiful. Caleb lifted his teacup, savoring the warmth against his palms, and tried not to think about the morning, when he would walk to town and mail the letter that would end everything. That was when Maisie began to scream. It was not a normal cat sound, not the meow of hunger or the yowl of annoyance. It was a continuous, desperate cry that raised the hair on Caleb's arms. She ran to the door, then back to him, then to the window, her single eye wide and luminous with urgency. Her claws scrabbled against the wooden floor as she paced, back and forth, her entire body vibrating with distress. Caleb set down his tea and watched her, his damaged ears catching only the muffled edges of her cries. He could feel his heartbeat quicken. Maisie had never behaved like this before. She was frantic, insistent, desperate for him to understand something he could not hear. He trusted her. That was the simple truth of it. After 7 years together, he had learned that Maisie's instincts were sharper than his own, that she perceived things his aging senses could no longer detect. If she said something was wrong, then something was wrong. Caleb pushed himself up from his chair, feeling his knees protest, and pulled on his heavy coat. The wool scarf that had been Lillian's hung by the door, still carrying the faintest scent of her lavender perfume. He wrapped it around his neck, the softness against his skin like a memory made tangible, and opened the door to the winter night. The cold hit him like a physical force, stealing his breath. Snow swirled in the beam of his flashlight as he swept it across the yard, looking for whatever had alarmed Maisie. At first, he saw nothing but white, the world erased and rewritten by the storm. Then he noticed them tiny footprints, barely visible, leading from the tree line toward his cabin. They were dragging, erratic, the marks of something injured and struggling. Caleb's heart clenched. He followed them, his boots crunching through the fresh snow, past the fence that marked the edge of his property and into the forest beyond. Maisie darted ahead of him, her tail high, leading the way with the certainty of someone who knew exactly where they were going. The footprints led him to a fallen tree, its massive trunk covered in snow and moss. Beneath it, curled into a space barely large enough to shelter a child, was a small creature. Caleb dropped to his knees, ignoring the cold seeping through his pants, and aimed his flashlight at what Maisie had found. It was a bobcat kitten, perhaps 3 or 4 months old, though it was difficult to tell in its current state. Its fur was matted and wet, darkened with blood around its face. Its eyes were closed, not in sleep but in damage, the lids crusted and swollen. The creature's breathing was shallow, rapid, its small body shivering so violently that Caleb could see the tremors even from a foot away. There was blood on the snow beneath it. dark and fresh, and the smell of infection was unmistakable. For a moment, Caleb simply stared. Part of him wanted to turn away, to leave this creature to nature's harsh judgment. He was old and tired, and he had just written a letter closing down his rescue station because he no longer had the strength for this kind of heartbreak. Another part of him, the part that had spent 20 years pulling injured animals back from death's edge, the part that still remembered what it felt like to have purpose, reached out with trembling hands. The kitten did not resist when he touched it. It was too weak, too close to the end. Caleb unwrapped Lillian's scarf from his own neck and carefully, gently, wrapped the small creature in the soft wool. It was still breathing, against all odds. In the freezing night, bleeding and blind and alone, it was still breathing. "You're not going anywhere, Caleb whispered, his voice rough with emotion he had not felt in months. "I'm taking you home." The walk back to the cabin seemed longer than it should have been. Caleb held the bundled kitten close to his chest, trying to share his body heat, and Maisie led the way with her tail held high like a flag. Inside, Caleb moved with a speed and efficiency he had thought lost to him. He carried the kitten to the small room that had once served as his examination and treatment area, laid it carefully on the stainless steel table that had seen so many desperate cases, and began the familiar work of triage. He turned on the heat lamp, its red glow transforming the room into something womb-like and warm. He cleaned the blood from the kitten's face with gentle swabs of warm water, revealing the extent of the damage. Both eyes were destroyed, the tissue damaged beyond any hope of repair. There were deep scratches along its face and neck, the marks of a predator, perhaps an eagle or a larger cat. It should have died hours ago in the forest. It should have died, but it had not. Caleb's hands, steadier now with purpose, moved through the familiar motions of his old work. He cleaned wounds, administered antibiotics from his dwindling supply, started an IV to combat dehydration. All the while, the kitten lay motionless in Lillian's scarf, its breathing shallow but persistent. Maisie sat on the counter, watching with her single eye, occasionally reaching out with one paw to gently touch the bundled form. When Caleb had done all he could, when he had pushed back the immediate crisis and bought a few more hours, he called Grace Alden. She was the veterinarian who served the scattered rural communities around Maple Creek, a woman in her 40s who had always supported his rescue work. She arrived within an hour, her truck cutting through the snow with chains rattling. Grace examined the kitten with professional thoroughness, her fingers gentle but probing. She checked vitals, studied the ruined eyes through a magnifying glass, ran her hands along the small body searching for internal injuries. Finally, she straightened and looked at Caleb with sympathy in her eyes. "The eye damage is permanent," she said softly. "Complete blindness. She'll never see again." Caleb had known it already, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real in a way that observation had not. He nodded, waiting for the rest. Given her age and condition, given that she's a wild animal who will never be able to survive on her own. Grace paused, choosing her words carefully. The humane option would be euthanasia. Caleb, a peaceful end. Caleb looked down at the small creature wrapped in his dead wife's scarf. The kitten's blind eyes were closed, but its body was still fighting, still pulling in breath after breath with stubborn determination. He thought about the letter on his kitchen table, the formal words requesting closure. He thought about how he had felt these past months, useless and alone, waiting to follow Lillian into the dark. He shook his head. "I can't. She's not ready to give up." He looked at Grace, and his voice was stronger than it had been in months. "Neither am I." Grace studied him for a long moment, then smiled. "Then I'll help you however I can." After Grace left with instructions for care and a promise to return in a few days, Caleb stood in the examination room and looked at the kitten who was now, somehow, his responsibility. He needed a name, something that captured what she was, a life that should have ended but had not, a flame that refused to be extinguished. "Ember," he said aloud, and Maisie chirped in approval. "Your name is Ember. A fading ember, maybe, but still alive beneath the ashes." The first weeks were the hardest. Ember was too weak to eat on her own, and Caleb had to feed her with a syringe every few hours, a mixture of formula and antibiotics that often came back up as quickly as it went down. He slept in the examination room, waking every few hours to check on her, to adjust the heat lamp, to clean the wounds that wept and crusted and slowly, impossibly, began to heal. Maisie never left them. She claimed a spot on the counter near the table and stayed there, watching Ember with her single eye. Sometimes she would hop down and curl herself against the kitten, purring with a deep, steady rhythm that seemed to calm Ember's restless movements. Caleb watched them together and saw something he had not expected: recognition. Maisie had been blind in one eye since he found her. Ember was blind in both. They were both survivors of violence, both marked by loss, and somehow they knew each other. On the fifth night, Ember lifted her head for the first time. On the seventh night, she stood on shaking legs. On the 10th night, she took her first steps, stumbling and uncertain, and walked directly into the wall. Caleb's heart broke watching her confusion, the way she stood there trembling, not understanding why the world had suddenly become hard and painful. That was when Maisie intervened. The old cat jumped down from her perch and walked to Ember, pressing her body against the kitten's side. Then she began to purr. Not just the normal rumble of contentment, but a specific rhythm, a pattern that seemed almost deliberate. Ember's ears swiveled toward the sound. Maisie walked a few steps forward, still purring, and Ember followed the sound, tentative but trusting. Caleb watched in amazement as Maisie began to teach Ember how to navigate the room. She would purr in a specific rhythm and tap her claws against the floor, creating a pattern of sound that Ember could follow. When Ember came to an obstacle, Maisie would change the rhythm, a warning signal. When the path was clear, she would purr, steady and low, in encouragement. Over the following days, Caleb realized he was witnessing something extraordinary: the creation of a language between two creatures who understood loss and survival in ways he was only beginning to comprehend. He began to help. He hung small bells around the examination room, each with a different tone: a brass bell by the window, bright and cheerful; a silver bell by the water bowl, clear and high; a wooden bell by the door, deep and resonant. Under each bell, he taped a small note in his own handwriting, where Maisie taught Ember to turn for the first time, where Ember first drank water alone, where Maisie stopped her from walking into danger. The room became a map of memories. Each bell a marker of progress, each note a celebration of survival. When Ember grew stronger and began to explore beyond the examination room, Caleb expanded his system. He hung bells throughout the cabin, creating a network of sound that transformed his home into something Ember could navigate through hearing alone. The brass bell in the living room, the ceramic bell in the kitchen, the metal bell by the back door, each one distinct, each one a guide. Ember learned fast. Within a month, she could move through the entire cabin with confidence, following the bells and Maisie's guiding purrs. She learned that the brass bell meant the soft rug by the fireplace, where she could sleep in warmth. She learned that the silver bell meant food and water. She learned that the ceramic bell meant Caleb's chair, where he would lift her into his lap and stroke her growing fur while reading aloud from Lillian's old books. Caleb found himself talking to Ember constantly, narrating his actions in a way he never had before. "I'm going to the kitchen now, girl. Follow the ceramic bell. Time for your medicine. Ember, come to the silver bell." His voice filled the silence that had oppressed him for 2 years, and he realized that in saving Ember, he was also saving himself from the quiet that had been eating him alive. Word spread through Maple Creek about the blind bobcat and the man who had saved her. People began stopping by, curious to see the creature they had heard about. At first, Caleb was reluctant to allow visitors, protective of Ember's fragile recovery. But when he saw how moved people were, watching Maisie guide Ember through the cabin with their private language of purrs and taps, he understood that this story was bigger than just his own healing. A local teacher brought her students on a field trip, and they sat in reverent silence as Caleb explained how Maisie had found Ember, how they had built a language of sound and touch. The children watched Ember follow the bells with the concentration of a student learning mathematics, and they left with a different understanding of what disability meant, what survival looked like. Donations began arriving, Small amounts at first, $5 here, $10 there, from people who had heard the story and wanted to help. Then larger sums from animal welfare organizations, from foundations that supported wildlife rehabilitation. The money came with notes for the Blind Bobcat, for Caleb's rescue station, for more creatures like Ember. Caleb stared at the growing pile of checks and cash on his kitchen table, next to the unmailed letter requesting closure. He picked up the letter, read it one more time, and then tore it into small pieces. The rescue station would not close. It would expand. He used the donations to repair the old enclosures in his yard, to build new ones suitable for wild animals with special needs. He bought equipment, upgraded his medical supplies, installed proper heating and lighting, and he did it all while Ember watched with her blind eyes. Her presence a constant reminder of why the work mattered. Ember became the symbol of the rescue station, its living emblem. Caleb had a local artist create a sign for the gate, Montgomery Wildlife Rescue, where the imperfect are worth saving. Beneath it, a painted image of a blind bobcat following a one-eyed cat. Caleb kept a journal, something he had not done since Lillian died. Every night, he would sit at the kitchen table with Ember curled in his lap and write about the day's events. "I thought I saved her," he wrote one night, his hand cramping around the pen. "But in truth, she helped me live again. I woke up this morning and I wanted to wake up. I made breakfast and I tasted it. I looked out at the snow and I thought it was beautiful. These are small things, perhaps, but they are everything." Ember's presence changed more than just Caleb's emotional state. She seemed to sense his physical pain with an accuracy that startled him. On mornings when his arthritis was particularly bad, when his joints were stiff and aching, Ember would appear at his side without being called. She would press her warm body against his leg, purring with that deep, steady rhythm that Maisie had taught her, and somehow the pain would ease, not disappear, but become manageable, something he could bear. When he sighed with exhaustion, Ember would come. When he moved slowly through the cabin, favoring his bad knee, Ember would walk beside him, matching his pace, her presence a comfort that went beyond words. Grace Alden, on one of her regular checkups, watched this interaction and shook her head in wonder. "I've seen therapy animals before," she said, "but never quite like this. She's reading you, Caleb, reading your body language, your breathing, your movements. She knows when you hurt." As Ember grew, she developed a confidence that belied her disability. She was not a pet, not truly domesticated, but something in between a wild creature who had chosen to trust, to live in partnership rather than captivity. She learned the rhythms of the household, the patterns of Caleb's days. She knew when he would wake, when he would eat, when he would make his rounds of the animal enclosures, and she followed him, navigating by sound and scent in some sixth sense that seemed almost supernatural. One afternoon, Caleb dropped his keys in the snow-covered yard and spent 20 minutes searching for them, his fingers growing numb with cold. He was about to give up when Ember appeared at his side, moving with purpose through the snow. She walked directly to a spot near the fence, stopped, and began to dig. Caleb followed her, skeptical but curious, and there beneath the thin layer of snow were his keys, the metal glinting in the weak winter sun. He stared at them, then at Ember, who sat back on her haunches with what could only be described as satisfaction. She had found them using scent and wind, using senses he had forgotten animals possessed. "You're showing off now," Caleb said, scratching behind her ears, and Ember's purr was deep and pleased. Another time. Caleb opened the refrigerator and the scent of fish wafted out, the salmon he had bought for dinner. Ember, who had been sleeping by the fireplace, was at his side in seconds, tapping her claws against his leg with insistent demand. She could not see the fish, but she knew it was there, and she wanted her share. Caleb laughed, a sound that felt rusty in his throat, and gave her a piece. She accepted it with regal dignity, as if she had won a negotiation. The defining moment of Ember's transformation came on a bright afternoon in early spring. Maisie was sunbathing near the fence, her favorite spot, where the wooden boards soaked up heat and reflected it back in waves. Caleb was working in one of the enclosures, checking on a red-tailed hawk with a broken wing. When he heard Maisie's distressed yowl, he ran toward the sound, his heart pounding, and saw a stray dog in the yard, a large German shepherd mix that must have squeezed through a gap in the fence. The dog was advancing on Maisie, who was backed into a corner, her fur standing on end, her single eye wide with fear, before Caleb could reach them. Ember appeared. She moved with a speed and certainty that stunned him, placing herself between Maisie and the dog. She was smaller than the dog, and blind, but none of that seemed to matter. She growled, a sound that came from deep in her chest, a warning that was older than language. The dog stopped, confused by this creature that challenged him without seeing him, and took a step back. Ember advanced, still growling, her body low and tense. The dog backed toward the fence, suddenly uncertain, and then turned and fled through the same gap it had entered. Ember stood guard until Caleb reached them, until he had checked that Maisie was unharmed, and only then did she relax, her growl fading into a satisfied purr. Caleb knelt beside her, his hands shaking with adrenaline and pride. "You brave girl," he whispered. "You fierce, brave girl." From that day forward, he never called her the blind girl again. She was the brave girl, and everyone who knew her story understood why. Spring became summer, and summer turned to fall. Ember continued to grow, filling out into a young adult bobcat with a thick, beautiful coat and a presence that commanded respect. Grace Alden came for a routine checkup and performed her usual examination, checking teeth, listening to heart and lungs, palpating the abdomen. Then she stopped, her hands still on Ember's belly, and looked up at Caleb with surprise in her eyes. "Caleb," she said slowly, "Ember is pregnant." The words seemed to hang in the air, impossible and yet undeniable. Caleb stared at Grace, then at Ember, who sat calmly on the examination table, purring as if she had known all along. "But how?" he asked, his mind racing through the past months. "She's never been outside the fence. Never." He stopped, remembering. 2 weeks ago, he had been tired, his routine disrupted by a rescue call in the middle of the night. He had come home at dawn and gone straight to bed, and in his exhaustion, he had forgotten to lock the back gate. When he woke, the gate was standing open, swinging slightly in the wind. Caleb went to his security camera footage, the system he had installed last year after a break-in at a neighbor's property. He scrolled through the recordings from that night and found it a male bobcat, moving through the yard with the confidence of a creature in his own territory. He came to the enclosure where Ember spent her nights, and she came to the fence, pressing herself against the wire. They touched noses, and then they were quiet together. Two wild creatures finding connection in the darkness. The male bobcat was gone by morning, vanished back into the Ashwood forest, but he had left a gift, though perhaps gift was the wrong word. He had left a consequence, a continuation, a future that Caleb had not planned for, but which arrived nonetheless. Ember's pregnancy progressed through the fall. Caleb prepared a nesting area in the examination room, filling a large wooden box with Lillian's old wool scarf, now washed and soft and carrying memories of 2 lives saved. Ember inspected the box thoroughly, using scent and touch, and then claimed it as her own. Maisie never left her side. As Ember grew heavier and slower, Maisie became increasingly protective, growling at anyone who approached too quickly, positioning herself between Ember and the door. Caleb watched them together and saw something deeper than friendship, deeper even than the bond between rescuer and rescued. They were family, chosen and built from shared trauma, and now they would welcome new life together. The kittens came on a cold November night, exactly 1 year after Caleb had found Ember in the forest. He heard Ember's low, laboring growl and came to the examination room to find Maisie already there, purring with that deep, specific rhythm that meant comfort and encouragement. Ember lay in the box, in Lillian's scarf, and worked through the contractions with the stoic determination of all mothers throughout time. Caleb stayed near but not too close, giving Ember space while remaining available if something went wrong. He need not have worried. Despite her blindness, despite the fact that no one had taught her what to do, Ember knew. She cleaned each kitten as it arrived, biting through cords, stimulating breathing with rough licks, pulling them to her belly to nurse, 4 kittens in total, perfect and healthy, mewling with the hunger of the newly alive. Maisie supervised the entire process, purring constantly, occasionally reaching out with a gentle paw to touch Ember's head when the last kitten was born and nursing. Maisie climbed into the box and curled herself beside Ember, becoming a second source of warmth and comfort. Ember leaned into her, exhausted and triumphant, and the two of them fell asleep together with the kittens between them. Caleb sat on the floor beside the box, tears running down his weathered cheeks. He had not cried since Lillian's funeral, had not allowed himself that release. But now, watching this makeshift family, seeing the continuation of life against all odds, he could not stop the tears. They were tears of joy and grief mingled together, tears for everything lost and everything found. He wrote in his journal that night, "No one taught her how to be a mother. Maisie never had kittens of her own. Ember never saw her own mother raise young. But love is an instinct born from the love one has received. Ember learned how to care from being cared for. She learned how to protect from being protected. She learned how to heal from being healed. And now she passes those lessons on to her kittens, teaching them through touch and sound and presence. The cycle continues. The love continues, and I am privileged to witness it." As the kittens grew, Ember taught them to navigate the world as she had learned to navigate it. She lulled them to sleep with a soft growl that carried the exact rhythm of Maisie's purr from long ago, the pattern that meant safety and comfort. She guided them through the cabin using the bells, showing them how to listen, how to use their ears and noses and whiskers to build a map of their surroundings. The kittens had their sight, but they learned to navigate as if they were blind, honoring their mother's disability by learning her language. Each morning, they followed Ember to the window in the living room, where she would stand and watch the world through wind and sound. She could not see the sunrise, but she could feel the warmth on her face, could smell the changing seasons, could hear the morning chorus of birds announcing a new day. The kittens stood beside her, learning what it meant to perceive the world beyond vision. One afternoon, when the kittens were 2 months old and full of energy and mischief, Ember led them outside for the first time. Caleb watched from the porch as she took them on a tour of the yard, stopping at each bell he had hung: the brass bell by the fence, the silver bell by the water trough, the wooden bell by the gate. The kittens investigated each one, batting at them with tiny paws, listening to the sounds, and then growling softly in response, as if confirming, "I remember. I understand." Caleb had tears in his eyes watching them. These kittens, half wild and fully healthy, learning to navigate the world from a mother who could not see it. They would eventually be released back into the Ashwood forest when they were old enough and skilled enough to survive. But they would carry with them something unique, an understanding that disability did not mean weakness, that different ways of perceiving the world were not inferior, but simply different. When spring arrived and the forest came alive with new growth, Caleb made his decision. The kittens were 6 months old now, young adults capable of surviving on their own. It was time to let them go. He opened the gate one morning and watched as they ventured into the forest, following Ember, who led them with confidence through trees she could not see but knew by sound and scent and feel. They were gone for 3 days. Caleb worried, paced the cabin, looked out into the forest with longing and fear. But on the 4th morning, he heard the bells ringing and found the entire family had returned. Ember and her 4 kittens, moving through the yard as if they had never left, following the familiar echoes home. They returned every few weeks after that, sometimes all together, sometimes just Ember alone. The kittens gradually stayed away longer, building their own territories in the forest, but they never forgot the bells, never forgot the way home. And Ember, who had been saved from death, who had learned to live without sight, who had become a mother and a teacher, always returned to the cabin where Caleb waited. That spring, a woman came to the rescue station seeking help. She was in her 60s, recently widowed, and she had adopted a blind cat from the local shelter. She was overwhelmed, uncertain how to help an animal that could not see, and someone had told her about Caleb and Ember. Caleb invited her in and showed her the bells, explained the language of sound and touch that Maisie had taught Ember. He showed her his journals, the notes he had kept about Ember's progress, The small victories and setbacks. He introduced her to Ember, who came when called and pressed herself against the woman's legs, purring with that deep, healing rhythm. The woman left with tears of hope in her eyes and a bag full of bells. Caleb watched her go and realized something profound. He was no longer alone in this work. He was no longer the last person who cared. He had become a seed from which others could grow, a source of knowledge and inspiration that would spread beyond his small cabin on the edge of the Ashwood forest. Over the following months, more people came. Volunteers who wanted to learn how to care for disabled animals. Veterinary students who wanted to understand the special challenges of wildlife rehabilitation. Teachers who wanted to bring their students to learn about resilience and adaptation. Caleb's rescue station, which he had nearly closed, became a hub of activity and learning. He founded a formal program that year, calling it the Ember Way after the bobcat who had started it all. It was a training center for volunteers, teaching them the techniques that Caleb and Maisie had developed through trial and error and love. The program focused on using guide animals, particularly house cats, to help rehabilitate wild animals with disabilities. It was unconventional, unprecedented, but it worked. In the main hall of the new building he constructed with donation money, Caleb hung a photograph. It showed him sitting in his chair with Maisie on one armrest and Ember on the other. The three of them looking at the camera with expressions of peace and belonging. Beneath it, he had inscribed a quote from his journal, the words that had come to him one night while watching Ember sleep. "We did not choose each other with our eyes, but with our hearts. Family is not something we choose. It is something that finds us when we are finally ready to open up." The program grew. Within 2 years, there were satellite centers in 3 other states, all using the Ember Way methodology. Within 5 years, it was being taught in veterinary schools as a legitimate approach to wildlife rehabilitation. And always, at the center of every lecture, every demonstration, every training session, was the story of a blind bobcat and a one-eyed cat and an old man who had decided not to give up. Caleb was 78 now, his hearing worse than ever, his joints protesting every morning when he rose from bed. But he rose anyway, because there was work to do, because there were animals who needed him, because Ember would be waiting by the door with her morning greeting growl. Maisie, ancient now at 14, still supervised from her favorite spot on the counter, her single eye watching everything with feline wisdom. On the 5th anniversary of finding Ember, Caleb held a celebration at the rescue station. People came from across the country, volunteers and donors and families who had learned to care for their own disabled animals using the Ember Way. They brought food and stories, filling the cabin and yard with laughter and warmth that reminded Caleb of holidays long past. When Lillian was alive and the house was full of life, Ember appeared that evening, emerging from the forest with 2 of her now adult kittens beside her. They walked through the crowd of people, following the bells that still hung throughout the property, and came to Caleb where he sat on the porch. Ember rubbed her face against his leg, purring, and Caleb scratched behind her ears, feeling the familiar texture of her fur, the solid warmth of her presence. "Thank you," he whispered to her, though she could not hear his words. "Thank you for finding me that night. Thank you for teaching me that it's never too late to start again." As the celebration continued around them, as people laughed and shared stories of animals saved and lives changed, Caleb looked out at his property and saw it transformed. What had been a dying rescue station run by a lonely old man was now a thriving center of learning and healing. What had been silence was now filled with sound voices and laughter and bells ringing in the wind. The bells hung everywhere, each one marking a memory, a moment, a victory over circumstance. The brass bell where Maisie first taught Ember to turn, the silver bell where Ember first drank water alone, the wooden bell where she first protected someone else, the ceramic bell where her kittens learned to follow sound. Each bell a story, each story a reminder that life continued, that love persisted, that family found you when you were ready. As darkness fell and people began to leave, Caleb sat on his porch with Maisie in his lap and Ember at his feet. The forest was alive with night sounds, owls calling, branches creaking, wind moving through leaves. Somewhere out there, Ember's kittens were living their own lives, carrying the lessons she had taught them, surviving and thriving despite coming from a mother who could not see. Caleb thought about the letter he had almost mailed, the formal request to close everything down. He thought about how close he had come to giving up, to deciding that his life no longer had purpose or meaning. And then he thought about the small creature he had found beneath a fallen tree, wrapped now in the scarf that had belonged to his wife, breathing against all odds. "We saved each other," he said aloud. "To Maisie and Ember and to Lillian's memory, all of us, we saved each other." The bells rang in the wind, their different tones creating a melody that only those who listened could hear. And in that melody was a message, simple and profound here. There is always a way home. Here the broken are made whole. Here the blind can see what matters. Here the lost are found. Caleb closed his eyes and listened to the bells, and for the first time in years, he felt complete. Every rescue begins with a heartbeat that refuses to give up. We're grateful you chose to listen to this one. If you'd like to hear more stories like this, a simple like or subscribe means the world to us.